I ended up going to this conference where I met a young church planter named Mark Driscoll. I came to Mars Hill in 1999. Even at that point, I wasn't going there to be on church staff. I was going there because they put out this album of original worship songs that I really love. It's about Mars Hill. It was both an incredible, fruitful thing as well as a distorted thing at the same time. You know, in retrospect, I think it's just a key part of American culture, particularly mashed up with the prosperity gospel, for humans to take credit for a lot of things. And that goes two ways, both a leader taking credit and the people want to attribute. But the reality is, but I remember this conversation with Driscoll, how it felt in kind of over my head and how we were in it together and stuff. And I just remember him saying, like, no, you're in this position because you're better than them. But there was an increasing sense that we had cracked the code and that most churches would be better off if they were more like us. And over time, just our growth became an end in itself. Attendance and financial growth became the mission. And it was brutal. And at the end, it culminated in this process of investigating these allegations that had come against Driscoll. And I don't believe there's any such thing as Christian music. There's no style of music advocated in the scriptures. And if we were going to really do music that sounded like the music of the early church, it would sound more like a Muslim call to prayer than Coldplay for Jesus. I just didn't challenge you. It starts with us as leaders, that our hearts would be more deeply moved by Jesus. And it will always be a conflict with the nuts and bolts. Sunday's always coming. But don't let yourself fall into pragmatism and don't let your heart get hard and just become a hired gun.
Welcome to the Creative Tides podcast, where expert insight flows into everyday creative spaces. We bring you conversations with leaders, innovators, and artists, making high-level ideas accessible and practical for your local context. Discover more episodes and upcoming events at www.creative-tides.com. We're glad you're here. Well, today we are joined by Tim Smith. Tim, thanks so much for being with us on the Creative Tides podcast.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here.
So we have your official bio, which I'm sure you wrote, but in kind of your own words, can you give us like a snapshot of who you are, what you do, what you're passionate about?
Yeah, I grew up in the Portland area. I'm an actual true Portland native, which feels like it's becoming more and more rare these days. But I grew up in like Southwest Portland, grew up in a Christian family, got into music in a pretty young age. And really through that, kind of my early kind of youth group church experience, started getting involved in more kind of ministry leadership. And that I didn't really aspire to be a pastor per se, but over time, bit by bit, in kind of baby steps, that's what I became. And so I've been involved in church leadership for one sort or another for a long time now. It's getting pretty close to 30 years, which kind of dates me. And I've had a lot of different roles, but always in the midst of whatever my leadership role was, I've always been involved in the music of the church. And I love music. I love Jesus, and the church is a real mess, but I still believe in it. And there's just something really powerful when the gospel of Jesus and music come together in a local church. I love the local church. I feel like there's a ton of pressure, and we'll talk more about this, but a ton of pressure for churches to be a lot less local and a lot more global these days. And I think that it's a real problem. I love the local church in all its weirdness and diversity. And so, long story short, I transitioned a few years back from being involved more in local church leadership to a bit more of a consulting role that I do with churches now, helping them think through why they do what they do in gathered worship. And that's a lot of my passion. I live in Southeast Portland, and I'm involved with a lot of churches and a lot of music. Let's see, I have 3 daughters that are older now, 20, 22, 24. I like to cook. I don't know. Those are the high points. Will that get us started?
Yeah, for sure. I'm a very linear thinker, so we're definitely going to get to your church consulting ministry.
Yeah.
But sort of starting back at the beginning. So you got involved with music at an early age. Was music a part of your household growing up, or was that like your own unique thing.
Yeah, it was. My parents were both musical. Both of them were a little less actively musical by the time I came around, but they were both definitely involved in music. Like my mom, she dabbled a little bit in piano, but sang in church choirs for a lot of her life. My dad played guitar and various other things, and he became a Christian in like the Southern California Jesus movement of the like late 60s, early 70s, and had a lot of that kind of like folky Christian music kind of feel. And like I said, he wasn't like actively involved in music as much, but their music was definitely a part of our home. I was encouraged to be musical, particularly be involved in church music from a pretty young age. I was in like church kids music things. I don't really remember how young I was, but like I would guess 10-ish or so. So yeah, I grew up around music, and particularly, church music. I kind of branched out from church music over time. But definitely grew up a lot around music. There wasn't music playing all the time. It was a bit more of like a special occasion thing. My parents were pretty hardcore on only Christian music, except for Christmas. Christian music and Christmas music, I think, was the main kinds of music that kind of went on at our house.
Yeah. So then you got more interested in music and kind of serving the church, you said, around youth group. Um, and you didn't necessarily seek out or intend to become a pastor, but your life kind of unfolded that way. Can you talk us through sort of how that happened? Because I think for a lot of young people, there's this pressure of what are you called to? And I was talking with a student recently of, well, how do I know what my calling is and if that should be my career? And so can you kind of say
Yeah.
that how you fell in love with the church and with music and worship music, but you weren't necessarily seeking being a pastor as a vocation. But
Hmm.
how did you navigate that as a young person?
Yeah. Yeah, man. How I navigated it was by fumbling and falling into things and only discerning a direction in the rearview mirror. That's the honest question. Calling, maybe we can talk more about this if you want to, but like calling is something I've thought a lot about. It's something I'm thinking a lot about even right now because I'm at kind of another transition in my life. Uh, but I think that I'll just say this. I won't go deep into this, but it kind of frames, I think, how I would tell my story more. Is as I've studied the scripture and looked up. At one point, I just looked up like every instance of the word calling in the Bible, and looked at the Greek words, particularly in the New Testament, underneath the word calling. And a lot of the times that calling shows up, it's like Jesus called out, "Hey, come over here." So you got to weed out all those. But after you weed out all those and you get to like a sense of how the Bible talks about calling, you're pretty hard pressed to find any instance where that is applied to what you do to earn money. Uh, and the primary usage in the Bible of the word calling is being called into relationship with Jesus. When it says things like make your calling and election sure, it's talking about salvation and knowing Jesus, knowing that you're saved by Jesus. So when we talk about God's calling, we're talking biblically about God's calling to know him, to follow him, to obey him, to become more like him. And then along the way, I think God does give direction. I think God gives us gifts to steward for his purposes. And then sometimes those gifts that he gives can overlap with what we do for a living.
Hmm.
But in the scriptures, those things often don't go together. And people say, like, well, what about Paul? Like, God called Paul. Well, God called Paul to belong to him. On that Damascus road, God called Paul to stop persecuting him. His words were, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And then he's like, I'm gonna send you to the very people you're persecuting. I'm gonna send you as an ambassador of the gospel of Jesus when you've been a soldier against the cause of Christ. But Paul is a perfect example of what I'm saying. Paul took great pride in not having to take money from most of the people who he served, because he said if he had to take money from them, he couldn't speak as freely what he felt like God needed for him to say. So, calling is actually God's direction. It's first and foremost relationship with God, and then it's God's direction that he can lead you on how to use your gifts. How you make money and make a living alongside that is often a very different matter. And my encouragement to young people, first and foremost, would be find a way to make money separate from using your gifts to build the church, if you have any possibility, because then you can do the music you truly feel that God is leading you to, as opposed to only what is the best fit with who is willing to pay me. So if I could encourage young people with anything, and I wish I did more of this, because I've been in church ministry, I didn't have a career before I went into ministry. And at a lot of different points, you end up with this conflict between like, who will pay me and what do I want to be a part of, you know? And God can work through that. It's a good thing. It's a good tension. It's a healthy tension. And yet you're always constrained if you have to make all your money from the church. So back to my story, off that little sermon there for you. That's a bonus.
If I just jump in before
yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think the danger in associating calling with your vocation and
Yeah.
I enjoy music and I love Jesus, so therefore I must be called to be in ministry
Mm,
and work at a church. I think the danger in that is when you have that overlap, it can be so easy for that vocation and that paid position to become the relationship with the Lord.
yeah.
And this is
Hmm.
actually something that, so I am on staff at a church. It was something that I felt to pursue as my career, but it can be so easy for me. And my lead pastor encourages us as a staff, like what you're doing on Sunday mornings and the lead up to what we're doing on Sunday mornings, that cannot be your relationship with Jesus. Like it has to be
Yes.
first, always, no matter what you're doing for a career, here first, and then the outpouring of that.
Yeah.
And and I remember when I was in high school, there was this pressure of I have to figure out what I'm doing and what is God calling me to be a pastor or a missionary or like, and it was always these few options, right, of what was pushed. And and that's not to say anything bad about like my time in youth group or how my youth pastor like led us. Like I'm so grateful for that time and it was so formative. And I still actually have relationship with my youth pastor, but there was this pressure not just from our local church but just people my age in youth group in general of you have to figure out what God is calling you to, and that
Yeah.
only meant what the career was. And
Yes.
as I have studied the scriptures, I'm seeing the same thing that you are, is the calling is to the Lord. And if we're going to associate calling to maybe an assignment, the calling of believers is to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit, like you said, to
Yeah.
obey Him. And then the Great Commission, to be discipled and to make disciples. And
Hmm.
how you do that and where your paycheck comes from doesn't really matter because your calling is there, whether
Totally.
you have seasons where maybe you are on staff at a church, maybe you're working at a McDonald's, like that. The paycheck part doesn't matter. The calling stays the same for every season. Maybe you work for a while and then you're a stay-at-home parent and you're changing diapers. Like your calling is still the same, to be
Yes.
discipled and to make disciples. And then I agree with you in the sense that yes, the Lord gives each unique giftings and unique ways of thinking and perspectives. And if we are truly committed to Jesus and serving him, our love for him should spill out, and what we do in action should be evidence of that. And so we
Yep.
should be using those giftings to serve him. And so I always think of the passage, I forget which New Testament epistle it's in, but where Paul talks about, to some God has given the gifting of teaching and preaching and being apostles and being prophets. And he kind of
Hmm.
goes through this list of here's things that you could do. But again, it's all in this context of
Yeah.
we're still called first and foremost to the Lord and
Yes.
to serving him and bringing people to him. And then here's the outpouring of what that could look like. And then Paul gets into specifics of if you're going to, be in a corporate gathering, here's the order, and he gets into the logistics of that. But yeah, I just
Totally.
you that And my heart really goes out to those who, are high school seniors or graduating college, where they just feel this pressure of, I have to figure out my entire life right now, and I have to have it figured out the day that I walk across that stage in graduation. And you don't.
Yes.
You just don't.
Yeah. Now more than ever, they're really, it's a very rare person that does one thing for their life. I mean, my father-in-law, my wife's dad, he was like a union machine shop guy who had two jobs his whole life. Like, he started working when he was 15, 16, and then he shifted, I think, when he was like 40, and went until he retired. It's like, man, that even in the blue collar world, like, that's getting super rare. You're going to do a bunch of different things. Two words I'll talk about briefly, and then I'll follow up and talk about my story that I think are key with this. One is vocation. I recently found this out, that the word vocation, the roots of it being used in the church actually go back to kind of medieval Catholicism in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. And if you know anything about Latin vocation, voca, vos, it's voice. The word means the voice of God. And the exclusive context for vocation in that medieval Catholic sense was, if you're discerning vocation, it still means this in the Catholic Church. If you're discerning vocation, you are discerning whether God is calling you to be one of three things: a priest, a nun, or a monk. And then those are the three vocations that God calls people to. And everyone else is called to kind of pay their way and observe the giftedness of these called people and benefit from their spirituality, because they're the ones that are really close to God in a way that everybody isn't. And that leads, in part, that idea of vocation, in part, is what leads to the Protestant Reformation, which is a strong rejection of that kind of dualism, that only a few people are called to be spiritual and everybody else is worldly, and they benefit from that. There are people who are called and they're closer to God than any of the rest of us could be. And so we sit and we benefit from their closeness to God. But man, doesn't that sound like a lot of ministry leadership culture today still? It still has a lot of that otherworldly medieval Catholic sense. Instead, we all have equal access to Christ through the same indwelling Spirit. We are a temple of the Holy Spirit. That's part of what the Protestant Reformation was about, which coincided historically with the invention of the printing press. So actually everyone had access to the scripture, not just a few trained folks. So vocation, in that sense, like, that's the classical sense of it. And I think that there's a lot of ways we need to reject that understanding. The second word is amateur. Has a negative context. We want to be professional. We want to be good. We want to be pro, right? But the word, and this is in part something I borrowed from my friend Josh White at Door of Hope. He's the first person that talked about this, but I read about it since, particularly with this old kind of Anglican priest guy named Robert Farrar Capon. But the idea of the amateur also, if you know a little bit about Latin, amor is love. The word amateur means the one who does a thing just because they love it, as opposed to a professional, which is the one who does it because they have to get paid. So the amateur musician doesn't mean the musician who sucks.
Yeah.
In the real true definition of the word, the amateur musician means they play music because they love it.
Yeah.
And they play the music that they love, as opposed to most professional musicians. The vast majority of professional musicians that make a living for it, they're like professional graphic designers. A graphic designer very, very rarely gets paid to do the art that they care about.
Right.
Instead, they get paid to brand this, can of soda pop or something, like they, or a new corporate suite of logos. It's not that that's wrong or whatever. It's just, that's what it means to be a professional. The vast majority of professional musicians are making radio jingles. They're making music for commercials to sell other people's stuff, just like that graphic designer, Only a very, very, very few, and now more than ever, fewer, can make a living financially off playing music that they love. And so my encouragement is, I mean, the world essentially kind of got together and decided music has no value financially, you know, in the streaming era. And so like your shot at being a professional musician where you get to play music for a living is so incredibly small. And that's sad.
Yeah.
It's a bummer. It's really depressing. And it's also the world that we live in, and I don't know how we're going to ever get away from that now. Once the world decides that something has no value, it's rare that they assign another monetary value to it. So my encouragement is like, yeah, it'd be great if you had an opportunity to even overlap a little with what you love and what you can make a living at, but do things because you love them. And find other ways to make money. And if you get that opportunity to make a living at something that you truly love, or even an aspect of what you love, that's great.
Yeah.
But it's rare.
Yeah.
It's rare.
And
it's not common.
Yeah, what you're saying too of gone are the days where you pick one profession and then that is your career from, you know, you graduate college now if you even go to college, but you graduate college until the day you retire. Like rarely are you doing the exact same thing for that whole span. And I think so. I personally I did feel led to pursue becoming a pastor, but even for me, like I don't see that from now until I retire. Like I see different ebbs and flows. And, you know, for you knowing just a little bit of your story, like you didn't necessarily seek that out, but it kind of happened. But now you're doing a different area aspect of ministry with your consulting. But what was that journey like that you did become a pastor?
Yeah. Just some of the high points along the way. I talked about how my parents were musical when I was going into kind of middle school. We settled down at, I think, one and committed more to one local church. It was in kind of Southwest Portland suburbs, out in Beaverton. It was called Southwest Hills Baptist. And when I started getting involved in the youth ministry there was this great youth leader. His name was Kurt Sell. And he was the classic scenario. This still happens sometimes, but it was super common in those days. This is like kind of late 80s going into the 90s, where he was like halftime worship director, halftime youth director. And his musical responsibility was to lead the contemporary service. Because there was like a traditional service, that's where he had the choir, and it was a lot more hymns and piano driven and that kind of thing. And then then there was the contemporary service, which was more like acoustic guitar and three chords for the Lord. And so he was that guy. And man, just Kurt was a huge inspiration to me, because I found that a lot of things that I had heard that were true about Jesus, I kind of internalized them in a different way when we sang them, either in youth group, you know, when he was leading songs at youth group, or when he was leading songs on Sunday. They're just, you know, what you heard and processed intellectually becomes something that is a bit more experienced and felt when you sing. And God just kind of got a hold of me through that in a way that I didn't really see coming as a young person. And like every good youth leader, he encouraged me then to start playing acoustic guitar. And like every good youth leader, he had a backup acoustic that he loaned me. And I took a few lessons, and then I eventually started, you know, by I think mid high school, I was starting to lead songs occasionally for the middle school kids at our church. And, you know, that would have been, I mean, about 30 years ago. And ever since, I've been involved in leading people in worship through song. And then fast forward, I kind of bounced around in a variety of different ministries. But then I ended up going to this conference where I met a guy, a young church planter named Mark Driscoll. It was a conference in 1998, in the fall of 1998 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was a time of a lot of cultural change as we kind of approached the kind of new millennium. And there was a lot of new churches being planted. It's kind of the beginning of this kind of modern church planting movement, whether you want to call it the young, restless, and reformed, or there's a bunch of different names that people have applied to it. But anyway, it was another one of these times when there was just this season of radical growth. I came to Mars Hill in 1999, and man, even at that point, I wasn't going there to be on church staff. I was going there because they put out this album of original worship songs that I really loved. And I just wanted to be a part of it. It was a boom of Microsoft was blowing up, and there's all these stories about kind of, making six figures as an intern at Microsoft, learning basic web design. And I thought, like, see if I can get some kind of job in the early kind of IT sector that was starting to blow up in Seattle at the same time as this church that was really intriguing to me. And so we moved to Seattle in 1999. And to me, I'd never really been very close to a pastor. And pastors to me were like highly trained religious professionals that kind of lived in a weird bubble, and I didn't feel like I could relate to. At this point, I hadn't really been to college. I like dabbled, some basic kind of, I did some general ed courses at Portland Community here and here in Portland, but I didn't really have much of a direction. I didn't really have much education, and I was getting kind of be one of those kind of cynical, slightly jaded youth group kids that kind of grows up and in a suburban church and is pretty critical of it and has conversations with my Christian friends of why can't the church be this way or that way different, and it drew me towards Mars Hill. It seemed like they were having those same conversations, but it started at church. And there was stories of people that didn't grow up in church becoming Christians. And that was something I just hadn't really seen much of. I've been around church for a long time, but it was mostly youth group kids rededicating their life to Jesus at camps, and there's nothing wrong with that. I was that kid, God works through that. God worked in my life through that. God's worked through a lot of other people's lives through that. There's pros and cons, there's trade-offs. But man, God just got a hold of me in a bunch of different ways at Mars Hill, in a way that I didn't really expect. I'd never been in a band when I came to Mars Hill. I'd never owned an electric guitar. It was just kind of flannel and various sandals and acoustic guitar and a few chords, a lot of choruses, there wasn't a lot of verses to the songs back in those days. It was like choruses. It was just like a repetitive chorus that you sang over and over again.
I know bridges.
Yeah, exactly. Like I could sing of your love forever. I could keep singing this song forever, right? Back in although Delirious did kind of usher in more of that like verse chorus pop song format. I think they were super influential in steering the church a little bit more in that direction, because before that it was a lot of like Maranatha and Vineyard and Hosanna Integrity choruses. Like I say, it's just a chorus on repeat, right? I'd never been in church leadership. I was newly married. I didn't really want to have kids. I thought there was enough humans in the world, and I didn't have a lot of hope for that. There was a good bit of like secret sin in my life, and the last thing I thought I'd be was a pastor. But being in that kind of the early days of Mars Hill, I got a different vision for a lot of these things. When I came to Mars Hill, it was a little under 2 years old. It was a couple hundred people meeting in a rented space in downtown Seattle, and man, it became the most profound season of growth, probably still to this day, that I think I've experienced in a concentrated amount of time. I was drawn deeper into the scriptures and theology than I ever had. I didn't grow up around people that were very theological. The church I grew up at wasn't particularly theological. My parents weren't particularly theological. They didn't like think about what the Bible has to say about a bunch of different things. It often just boiled down a lot more to kind of moralism and behavior kind of modification. So I got drawn deeper into the scriptures and theology. I found I had leadership ability that I had no idea that I had, that other people saw in me, but I didn't really see in myself. I got drawn into music more than ever. In the early days of Mars Hill, we ran what was for the time the only all ages concert venue in Seattle. And it was like a club doing shows, and it wasn't like do the show and then like somebody gets up and preaches the gospel in between the shows. It was like just mainstream music, and particularly because it was an all ages venue, it was a lot of punk and hardcore bands that didn't have anywhere else to play. And so 6 nights a week it was a venue, and then on Sunday night we had church gatherings. And so this amazing, profound experience of immersing myself in the scriptures and theology and the music scene of Seattle, and how that all came together then in the music of this new church plant called Mars Hill. It was just a super profound education that I couldn't have bought at any school. I also became go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you move there to be on staff, or did you just move because you were drawn to the music that this church was putting out?
I moved because I wanted to be involved, and there wasn't a lot of staff. So I just assumed I was going to be a volunteer. And then
So it wasn't like Mark sought you out and hired you after having met you at the conference. Okay.
No, there was no money on the table. There was a lot of interns, which meant you work for free. And so I got involved from day one, but it wasn't a paid position. But Driscoll saw potential in me as a leader. There was a lot of musicians involved, and I was not the best musician, but there wasn't as much leadership within the musicians. And so what he saw in me was the potential to like work on my music, but some leadership skill to try and, we had a lot of analogies like the herd the cats, or the goat rodeo, how to bring together these, and the musicians that were in the early days of Mars Hill, like almost none of them had ever been involved in church music before. Driscoll didn't grow up in the church. He grew up Catholic, like nominal Catholic. Got saved, became a Christian partway through college at Western Washington University, and just thought Christian culture was the weirdest, lamest thing ever. And so Mars Hill culture, probably to a fault, it was like a lot of things about Mars Hill. It was both a incredible, fruitful thing as well as like a distorted thing at the same time. The fruitful thing was we were very highly contextualized. So Driscoll's thing was like, Christian music is music for people that don't like music. Let's actually just make good music. And our church music should be biblical. When he looked at a lot of modern worship music, he's like, the lyrics aren't particularly biblical and the music is terrible. So what if we go deeper on both? And so he was out like just trying to recruit people that were active in the music scene of Seattle that had very little, if anything, to do with church. Most of the musicians that played as a part of Mars Hill music, like I say, they'd never been involved in church music. If they grew up in the church, they were kind of de-churched and kind of came back to church in a new way at Mars Hill. And so it was a really unique kind of very hyper local. I mean, our standard was Christian music sucks. CCLI is the license you get for Christian music. So we won't get a CCLI license. Our standard is pretty much we don't play anything that's covered by CCLI. So everything that all the music in the early days of Mars Hill was either written by dead people, old hymns, or written at Mars Hill, or written by a friend of ours at some other church. And that created this really fruitful, highly local, contextualized culture of worship. But at the same time, it also created the distortion is an anti-theology, like defining yourself by what you're not, particularly when it's other Christians, is inherently, prideful and arrogant and separates you from your brothers and sisters in Christ who you'll be with for all eternity. So, like all churches, Mars Hill is a real mashup of like beautiful work of God and a really distorted, messy work of human ambition at the same time. Always both. Always wrapped up and bound together, right?
I can imagine too that there was probably high pressure to crank out X amount of songs every month, or was Mark really involved with the songwriting process and like the theology in the songs, or was that more on you guys as the musicians and the writers? Did he kind of take a step back from that?
I think we certainly ran things by him, particularly lyrically, and he definitely had opinions, but he did, particularly in the early days, he left us a lot more to ourselves. And there wasn't actually, I'm just even thinking back in the early days, there wasn't the kind of pressure that would come later with a lot more growth. It was a bit more indigenous, and a lot of these, I'm not indigenous. I don't know what organic is what comes to mind. It's so overused, but like it was a local church culture that in a lot of ways kind of naturally perpetuated itself. Like there was musicians everywhere, and musicians that were writing songs for their bands, writing songs just to express themselves personally that never saw the light of day, and then occasionally writing songs for the church. There was a lot of looking through old hymnals for lyrics and writing music to go with it. And it happened a lot, so it wasn't actually a ton of the pressure all came later with growth, as it often does. But it was, there was something really beautiful about those early days. And that's often the case with a lot of church plants I've been around, or stories of church plants, kind of like the early days of a marriage. Like there's something beautiful about those early days, but you kind of like your kids. Like there's something beautiful about a 2-year-old, but they don't stay that way, and that's also by God's design. Like you move on from that in some ways. And, there's a reason why a lot of marriages don't make it past the second year. And then even more marriages don't make it past the fourth or fifth year, because these are key transitions where the newness kind of wears off and you've actually got to know the person and you're like, I didn't realize this is what I signed up for. Right. And that either is something that pulls you apart or something that brings you together, more deeply. And so there was a lot of that beauty in those early days, but it moved on in some healthy ways and other less healthy ways. But that's how God kind of got a hold of me. Within a year, so I became an intern leading the worship department. Eventually, I started getting paid a little bit. They challenged me to go through an eldership process, which I'd never really been around the idea of elder as much. I think the church I grew up at had elders, but it wasn't prominent like it is in more elder-led churches today. And I just got a vision of a different way of church leadership that really captivated me. And within a year and a half of when I was there, I became the first worship pastor for the church, and continued, until Mars Hill ended at the end of 2014. And once Driscoll resigned in that kind of tail end of the life of the church, I was the longest running staff member and elder at the church. So I was like pretty involved for a long time. A lot of folks came and went in that time. But it was a really profound experience, and a lot of that development happened, there at Mars Hill.
Yeah. So Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll, these are, if you're in the church world, like these are probably familiar, somewhat familiar things for those who are listening. What did sort of your time ending at Mars Hill, what did that look like?
Yeah. So fast forward, Mars Hill just grew and grew and grew. It grew. For the first 10 years I was at Mars Hill, it grew 50 to 200% every single year.
Wow.
Which is a lot of what people dream about in church leadership. But when it happens, and I'm not saying I wish it didn't happen, it was amazing. It was an incredible thing to be a part of. I don't know if I'll ever experience anything quite like that again. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot that comes with that growth. So it was, and that growth went beyond, in retrospect, I think it's just a key part of American culture, particularly mashed up with the prosperity gospel, for humans to take credit for a lot of things. And that goes two ways, both a leader taking credit and the people want to attribute, kind of back to that idea of vocation, that otherworldly sense that like certain people are more spiritual than others, and God uses them in ways he doesn't use the rest of us. And so it goes both ways. Like unhealthy leaders take credit for what only God was doing. And folk are eager, church folk can also be pretty eager at times to give credit also in that way, as like, God works through this guy in a way that he doesn't work through anybody else. It's amazing. But the reality is, like, God brings the growth. A pastor I've been getting to know a little bit more, named Alan Frau in Orange County at this church called Southlands. He said it perfectly recently when I was down visiting this church, where he said, God brings the growth. We leaders steward the growth that God gives. And that's very much how I see my time at Marceau. That's how I see Driscoll. God brought growth. He worked through our gifts, but we stewarded it. I can't recreate. People, I get job offers all the time that they think they can bring me to a Midwest suburb and recreate some version of the arts movement that happened in Seattle in the in the early 2000s. And that was a unique move of God and a unique time and a unique place. I can't do that again. I didn't make it happen.
Right.
I stewarded that growth. I helped shape it, and kind of like I shepherded. I guess that's the biblical word. The shepherd doesn't create the sheep. He steers them a little bit and tries to keep them together. That's what I did.
When you were in it, did you have to fight against, I guess, that pride of feeling like it was, and you, but also just kind of the staff that was there? Like, was it hard to fight that pride of like, oh, look at what we're doing, and like we're putting on this really attractive church that are drawing people in? Like, was that a tension, or was it pretty just mind blowing? Like God was clearly the one growing it. Like, what was kind of your heart posture, I guess, to put it in a really Christian-y way? Well,
sure.
like,
Yeah.
you're in the middle of it, and it was just growing so rapidly.
I don't think it was a fight for a long time, because we just believed we were better than everybody. It wasn't a fight. That's the honest answer. I remember a conversation I don't remember what the issue was. It was some key growth threshold. Oh, I do remember. It was when we were moving into our first large church building. I don't remember what the specific issue was, but I remember this conversation with Driscoll, and I was talking about like what it takes to do this particular thing that needed to be done, and how I felt in kind of over my head, and how we were in it together and stuff. And I just remember him saying like pretty straight face, like, no, you're in this position because you're better than them. And we really believed that, and there was tons of humility as well. And I'm saying that that's like all Driscoll ever believed. But there was an increasing sense that we had cracked the code, and that most churches would be better off if they were more like us. And a lot of churches would be best to shut down and just turn over their resources to us, because we could do a lot better with them. Turn over their building, turn over their money, turn over whatever leaders that we were interested in. A lot of them we wouldn't be, because we tended to not hire anybody that had church leadership experience.
Because you kind of wanted to do your own thing.
Yeah, we were so set for a long time on being our own thing.
Yeah. And
so we mostly raised up leaders from within. And there's some merit to that too. Just like I said, at every point, an incredible work of God to behold, and an incredible work of human ambition at the same time, all mixed up together, all woven together like a multi-stranded cord that's braided. You take a cross section, and every time there's always this thread of ambition, improving yourself before God and others woven in. So yeah, for a lot of time, it wasn't a tension, because we're kind of increasingly full of ourselves. And this is the case today. There's now more metrics than ever by which to judge your success and compare yourself to others. And there's all these growth lists and most influential church lists. And for a long time, we were at the top of these. People came from all over the world just to be a part of the church or to learn from us at our conferences. And when you get enough people like hanging on your every word, where they'll pay good money for you to just like sit on a stool and just ramble, like, and say whatever comes out of wherever you want to say. You start, it's pretty hard to think of yourself with humility and sober judgment, like the scripture says. Right. Over time, for me personally, and others, lots of others, it did become more of a conflict, and I did become less and less comfortable with that. I think I got convicted a lot of that sense of arrogance, of like I said earlier, that anti-theology of not wanting to be like other Christians. You can be distinct and have a very local contextualized identity without being condemning towards others that don't hold that, and so I think it did become, I think there was more humility that grew, but honestly, the humility grew most, I think, in the latter years of just seeing how it didn't work. I think your question that started this next rabbit trail was like how it ended, and over time, just our growth became an end in itself. Attendance and financial growth became the mission of the church. And this is also the case. If you're not careful, growth is super easy to become an end in itself. And almost nobody would justify that, like biblically or spiritually, and actually say it that clearly. Like, we exist to grow. We exist for dollars in the bank and butts in seats. Yeah. Very few people would say that. But that's all. But that is often the functional motivation. It's what you measure often drives what you do. Right. And yeah. If the primary metrics that you use are numerical growth metrics, you can say that there's this guy Harold Best, who wrote one of my favorite books on a theology of worship called Unceasing Worship, and he has these terms that I've used ever since I read them called policy and operations theology. Policy theology is like the theoretical big ideas that you say guides you. Operations theology is the stuff that actually guides you. And the goal is for those two things. I do this a lot with the Venn diagram. This is the Venn, the goal is for them to be as unified and overlapping as possible, that your policy theology, your big biblical, theological, philosophical ideas are unified with your practice. But these things naturally drift further and further apart, where it's super easy to like preach all these big ideals, but at the end of the day, what really drives you is putting on a better show than other churches to attract more customers to your religious products and programming, to get more dollars and more butts and seats, usually from other churches. That is the functional purpose for a lot of church. And if you don't have another clear purpose in mind, and if you don't discipline yourself actively to refine your practice in light of those purposes, you end up going there. And that's what happened with Marcel. And so everything, Driscoll has famously talked about, you either get on the bus or you end up under the bus, and the bus is growth. And if you can't roll with every growth transition of 50 to 200% growth every year, you're, who are you to slow down the mission of God? The mission of God no relationship is more important in that world, in that line of thinking. No personal relationship is more important than the mission of God. It's like, oh, you're gonna prioritize friendship with that person over more people getting saved?
Mm.
That's the thinking, as if just, attendance is people getting saved, which it wasn't. Even our baptisms wasn't people getting saved, because over time, our baptism numbers were dramatically inflated because we went from like screening people to get baptized to just like anybody can get dunked in a big event who wants to, no matter how many times they've been dunked before. We'd ask them a couple questions, but it wasn't like a process, like I think would be a bit more healthy. And then we reported every single baptism as if it were a conversion.
Mm.
So like they don't see the dollars we see, they don't see the attendance we see, they don't see the baptisms we see. That becomes your justification for everything. The justification for everything becomes, look at the fruit. How can you argue with the fruit? Yeah, this is a little rough around the edges. Yeah, Driscoll may have hurt some people, but look at the fruit. And so more and more bodies metaphorically piled up behind the bus until the whole thing just attained this critical mass. And now, it's almost like some people call it church too, like me too, whatever. You see these kind of conflict cycles where initially there's like this denial and you just put your head down and keep going and don't even address it. And then it becomes so big, you have to make some statements. And then if you don't do it right, that pours gas on the fire unintentionally. And it sometimes it can just grow and grow and grow. And it did until Mars Hill died, and so by 2014, it was just conflict and controversy everywhere. Pastoral ministry had become firefighting, forest firefighting, in one of those just giant forest fires that reports like, yes, we're 2 months in and it's 5% contained. We're all familiar with this language in the Northwest now as the more and more fires or any Californians listening are even more familiar. And it was brutal. Like Mars Hill changed my life. And at the end, it culminated in this process of investigating these allegations that had come against Driscoll. And I was involved in this small group that was doing this investigating, and I'm charged with alongside another pastor friend of mine to do these interviews. We had all these pairs of folks that were doing these investigation interviews, and it was like digging up all the old conflict and wounds, all the carnage that had come. For a long time, we leaned really into that fruitful side of the ministry and tried to ignore a lot of the distorted, destructive side of the ministry, because look at the fruit. Until you couldn't ignore it anymore, and for me, it was like it was just brutal. And that's what led to the end of Mars Hill. We were the church of Driscoll right before he stepped out of kind of actively preaching, to kind of step away while this investigation took place in the weeks. I can't remember whether it was the week that this happened or right around that time, but he said in retrospect, I think almost kind of prophetically, that what his fear for Mars Hill was that it would be like the church of Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2. The one that he says, like, hey, you've stood for some good things theologically. You've stood against some theological errors. That's good. But this I have against you. You lost your first love. And the phrase in the Greek is the love you had at first, which, is it love for one another? Is it love for God? It doesn't specify. I think it's probably both. And I think that that's a lot of how Mars Hill went sideways. I think almost everything can be a bullet point underneath that. A lot of things became more important than loving God and loving others.
Yeah.
And the extent to which ministry becomes about proving yourself, of how you're worthy as a person before God and over and against other Christians in competition with others, is the extent to which you will do terrible, horrible, no good, very bad things. A lot of hurt will happen.
Yeah, I think that's a huge risk too when you do choose ministry, being on staff at a church as your career. We talked earlier about there's that risk you have to keep in check, that it's about you and the Lord first, and that ministry doesn't become your relationship with Jesus. But the other risk is it becomes your identity, and
Yeah.
you don't know who you are, or like you just don't have any sense of identity or purpose when you are removed from being on staff at a church. So for you, Mars Hill falls apart and that season of your life comes to a close. How did you process your identity and who you are? But this is a big question. How did you not just deconstruct and walk away fully from all of it? Like walk away fully from Jesus? Like how did you separate? This was church implosion, but not worthy of being like my faith imploding.
Yeah.
Hey friends, before we jump back into today's conversation, we just want to say we're so glad that you're here. And today's episode is sponsored by us, Creative Tides, and by you. This show exists to bring expertise locally, real voices, real insight, and practical wisdom into our creative community. As a nonprofit, everything that we do as Creative Tides is made possible by people who believe in that mission. If this podcast has served you, one way you can support it is by giving a one-time or recurring donation, or by purchasing something from our merch shop. As a thank you for being here, we want to offer you 10% off the merch of your choice. Head to creative-tides.com/merch and use code podcast at checkout to receive 10% off. Every contribution helps us keep creating, hosting conversations, and bringing expertise closer to home. Make sure you like and subscribe so that you don't miss any upcoming videos, resources, or events. Thank you for being part of this work with us. Now let's get back to our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I'm not reticent to answer it at all. There's just a lot that can be said. And I would say too, so many people who go through something similar to what I've gone through, and there's lots of people. There's some uniqueness to the context of Mars Hill, but there's a lot of people that go through this. And I think, unfortunately, some of them, at least the stories that get a lot of airtime, seems like, they tell the story as a heroic journey where, yes, it all came to a head. It got really bad, and then I solved it, and now, it's been awesome ever since. And that is not my story. I'm still in the middle of the working that out. Now, I think life with Jesus is kind of like a graph where like things well up and you have these kind of growth points and high points and low points. Like it kind of goes for a while, but then something, some kind of conflict forces an issue or a life transition or something like that. Like there are concentrated times. Even as I've talked about my life, like getting involved in youth ministry and learning from that youth leader was a big kind of blip, that pushed me forward into more maturity and more of a sense of who I am. Coming to Mars Hill in those early years was another one of those. The end of Mars Hill was another one of these, but it's ongoing. There's this concept in psychology that I read in a book by this guy. It's called The Other Half of Church. His name is Jim Wilder, I think. But he calls it state-dependent learning. And the psychological concept is, say if you completely freak out when you end up in a relational conflict situation, you can only learn how to grow in your ability to deal with relational conflict when you're in relational conflict again. You can't go away off in peacetime, and you can learn some things, but you don't really know if you've internalized it until you end up in another sticky situation. And so, you can't, applying that to identity and ministry, everybody that's involved in church leadership to one degree or another ends up struggling with their identity. And you can't really deal with putting your identity in the right place until it's in the wrong place, I think. You can't learn how to go without something until it's challenged. You don't know what it'd be like to lose your house until you lose your house. You don't know what it's like to lose a relationship until you've lost a relationship. You can speculate, you can theorize, but And so I think your identity is challenged in a number of ways, and God brings these things to a head divinely at different points where you have to deal with that. So there was definitely a season at the end of Mars Hill, but for me personally, I didn't really have time to deal with much. Because for me, we had 7 weeks from when we decided, when Driscoll resigned at Mars Hill, we quickly decided we were not going to be able to continue as Mars Hill, and that every church at that time, there was 15 churches across 5 states. Every church that could had 7 weeks to stand themselves up as an independent church plant.
Wow.
So this was like early November. You had until December, and you were done. And so out of that, 11 churches made a run at it. A few of them that were close in proximity to one another in the Puget Sound area decided to merge together immediately. And over the course, I can't remember what the number is currently right now. A few others have trailed off, but we had 7 weeks to become an independent church in Portland. What was Mars in 2011? That's an important part of the story. I was the central worship pastor for a long time in Seattle, and then in 2011, I came back to Portland to start Mars Hill Church Portland. We were in the Puget Sound. We were in Portland. At one point, we were in Orange County. At one point, the beginnings of a thing in LA, Phoenix, and Albuquerque, in terms of other states and such. And so I didn't have time to process much. Like, I went through this counseling intensive early in 2015, and it was somewhat helpful, but I immediately had to figure out how to be a weekly preacher. I'd preached a fair amount over the years as like someone who was like in a preaching rotation, but I think the most I'd ever preached was maybe 2 or 3 weeks in a row, maybe like 12 or so times a year. And so I had a lot of theology. It certainly was on the platform all the time. Like, I didn't usually, like a beginning preacher has all this like theological education, but none of the leadership and upfront experience. I had all that upfront experience and a good like theological foundation, but I didn't have the nuts and bolts of like how to do it week in and week out. And so I became like the primary preacher of this church that became Redeemer Church Portland. And so, man, I was just in the weeds, honestly. Like, there was some that got dealt with along the way, and I won't go into all the details, but in a lot of ways, what happened behind the scenes at Redeemer was as much or more conflict, and in some ways more intense and more personally destructive and violent for me than most of what happened for me personally at Mars Hill. So it was a real mess. So there's a real sense in which I think there's a good bit that I don't think got dealt with more decisively until the Mars Hill podcast came out and I'd stepped down for the first time in ministry. So the high points of what happened is Mars Hill ended in 2000. At the end of 2014, we shifted from being Mars Hill Church Portland to Redeemer Church Portland in the beginning of 2015. And then I served there as like a preaching and worship pastor. And then in 2018, like 3 years later, we merged with Door of Hope, another church here in Southeast Portland that a number of your local folks are probably familiar with in some way or other. We weren't very stable. Door of Hope was more stable. We had an amazing building in Southeast Portland. Door of Hope didn't have a building at that time. They did, but they'd really outgrown it and were meeting in a rented space that was larger because they just couldn't handle this building that they had in Northeast. It only sat like maybe 150 people, and it was a church of, I can't remember at the time, 700-800, and so they were meeting at Revolution Hall, which is like an event venue in Southeast Portland. And so we merged with Door of Hope, and I became an associate initially, and then an exec pastor of sorts at Door of Hope. And then in 21, I stepped down from Door of Hope and eventually ended up doing a version of the ministry that I do now, consulting and doing interim work and working with worship leaders and that kind of a thing. So when I stepped down in 21, that was right around the time that Christianity Today and a good friend of mine, a guy named Mike Cosper, who was newly at Christianity Today to kind of start a new media division of CT, particularly through podcasts. He did this big podcast that some of your listeners have probably heard of called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And that started in 21, right as I stepped down. So it was in 21, it was the first time that I wasn't a pastor in a long time. I turned 46 that year. So you can do the math. I just turned 50. Well, not just, back in February. I turned 46 in 21, and I had started in, church staff positions when I was 23. So it was like the halfway point of my life. Like I'd spent half my life at that point on staff at a church. And for the first time, I wasn't on staff at a church, and it was a huge identity crisis. And then in the middle of all that, we did this podcast kind of dredging up all the Mars Hill stuff and processing it in a very, I think that Mars Hill podcast was kind of like group therapy for the whole evangelical church. And that was definitely, it was very therapeutic for me. I was reliving a lot of this stuff and seeing a really great counselor at the time. And so it was literally like I'd do an interview for the podcast, I'd listen to a podcast, I'd go to therapy. And it was like this for
processed.
What's that?
Was that the first time you'd really like started to process everything that?
I mean, I definitely had processed a good bit along the way, and I'd seen a counselor at other points along that way. But it was, I think a lot of people's walk with Jesus, and mine for sure, is kind of like these series of things where you have these growth spurts, and in retrospect, you're like, geez, man, what was I even doing before that? And so I definitely did process, but that was such a profound therapeutic experience. In retrospect, it's like I had been doing some, but a lot got done in those circumstances. Because like I said, like you can't, I won't say you can't, but there's a limit to how much I think you can unravel your identity while you're in the middle of something you find your identity in. Often, our identity gets really challenged, and that's how we straighten it out a bit. You're finding your identity in a relationship, and the relationship hits a real rocky patch, or maybe it's a divorce or a breakup when somebody you thought you were going to get married to, or something. Or a job you thought you'd do for your whole life, you unexpectedly get laid off or fired. You didn't realize you had your identity so deeply in that until it's taken away. And so for me, it was super profound, God-ordained time of growth that God used in just a really deep way in my life, because for the first time I wasn't a pastor in a long time. And I put so much identity in that. And I didn't step down from Door of Hope with a clear sense of what God was leading me to. It was kind of a mutual decision between Door of Hope and I. Felt like God was leading me to something different. I didn't know what it was. And they were generous with me on the way out, which I'm super grateful for, which bought me some time to do, to have a full midlife crisis, so I'm really grateful for that. I didn't solve it all, but I definitely learned a lot. I learned a ton about myself and what I had internalized, just how much I was in ministry to kind of prove myself and to kind of compete you like I say, you just don't realize it until it kind of gets more challenged. So that was a really profound experience. So the end of Mars Hill, it was a big transition for me. But in some ways, even, Door of Hope was very different than Mars Hill. I don't want to even insinuate that it was more of the same, because Door of Hope is very different. Every church has their strengths and weaknesses. Door of Hope's strengths and weaknesses were super different than Mars Hill. But for me personally, because I just stayed in it, there's almost kind of like, it felt like I didn't kind of break the cycle until I stepped out of Door of Hope. For me, there's things I see in retrospect that just continued in my life in ways I thought I was being different at Door of Hope, where in retrospect, I think I was still caught in a lot of similar patterns in my leadership as I had at Mars Hill. without realizing, because there wasn't really a break. They did give me a sabbatical, and that was super helpful, but I wasn't very intentional with it. I'd never had a sabbatical before. And so it was mostly just a diversion, and that was very welcome. It was a very good break. That was at the like 2021 year point of ministry, and I had never really had a sabbatical, and they gave me 3 months off on my way into Door of Hope, which I'm so grateful for. And I did some counseling, but I could have been more intentional with it at the time. Anyway, all that to say, like, for me, I think a lot needed to be done in my heart that for whatever reason, I wasn't able to find my way to that point while staying in ministry. I'm not saying that's how it's got to be for everybody, but I do find, and that's advice I give to folk of all ages when they're at a crossroads, like, is there a way you could step away from some of the intensity of church leadership for a time? Because there's something so profound that happened for me, when I was able to take a break from that for a time, that for me, I don't know how I could have, I wasn't able to find a way to do that while I was still in it. Some people can. I'm not saying that path is right for everybody, but I think it could be helpful to at least consider for a lot of people. And that's the downside of seeing ministry sometimes as a profession, where it's like, I can't let it go because I don't know what else I would do for money. That's why I say, like, man, if you're young and considering ministry, like, it's not wrong to go into more vocational ministry, but man, if there's any way you can find some other things to do to have at least a backup plan as a trade or other skills, because then you could be a part of a church plant who couldn't pay you first time, that you feel like God is leading you to. Where if you have to make all your money from that, then you can only choose between those who will pay you. And it can become kind of mercenary, and you can find yourself in there white knuckling it, like I was, like the good soldier, like staying in it because I can't let anybody down. Like, I've got to stay in this no matter what. And it was killing me. It's a real codependent thing. It's like, I love you, but you're killing me. Kind of like a bad relationship. It can be about, I guess it's exactly like a bad relationship sometimes, like I just can't quit you. And so sometimes I think we need a break more than we can even realize until we've had it,
Yeah. Yeah, the church is the church, big C church, in the West, the Western church. It's become such a weird, its own like subculture, and
Yeah.
I think that's attributed to a lot of different mega churches that have kind of set different standards, whether they intended to or not. They've kind of set different standards of what it should look like aesthetically, what it should look like with worship and the preaching style, and how many programs you're putting on and all of that. So it's really become its own enigma, and it's honestly a very strange world. I did
Yes.
grow up in church. I'm a pastor's kid, and now I am working at a church, and I love it. But I also am not blind to the fact that it is a very strange world, and there's no other organization you could work for that is the same. That is like the church. But along with that, because of how I feel we've really strayed, the Western church has strayed a lot from the Acts 2 model of the church, of biblically what scripture outlines of this is the function of the church and the purpose, and this is what the church looks like. I've gotten to hear you speak to this a little bit a few times, but you've now shifted into this more consulting role with your ministry, Moved by Glory. And one of the things that you speak on is how the church is not Christian entertainment. Can you unpack
Mm,
that for us and talk through?
yeah. Just as a side note, seems like maybe we're going to do a two-parter here.
We might have to.
Cool. Sorry. I mean, I didn't anticipate going to all these other places, but I honestly, I think that the things that I've said could be helpful for people. And these are like conversations I get in over and over again with people. And I think, yeah, anyway, hopefully it can be helpful, or feel free to edit it however you want. So
I think it's really important. Are you okay on time if we?
I am. Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to hear your the Christian entertainment and moved by
Yeah.
glory. And then I think we're close to ending after that. But I
Yeah.
think I really, especially, myself being a millennial, and
Hmm.
I have stayed in church, but I have had my own season of just like wrestling, and deconstructing is such an overused term, but it is like
Yeah.
the millennial term of like really honestly what it is wrestling with your faith, which everybody
Yeah.
should do, is like ask
Yeah.
questions and like wrestle so that you come to a place where you're actually convicted and it's not just because somebody told you to believe this. But I think it's so important to speak to that of like your identity can't be in the church, and you have to like you will have seasons of wrestle and struggle, and that's okay. Like just kind of talking about it so people don't think, oh, I was hurt by the church, therefore I'm just going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and just forget the whole thing.
Yes.
So I'm really
Totally.
passionate about that. And I've seen a lot of my friends from youth group, which was a great experience. Most of those friends are not serving the Lord, and they're just doing their own thing. And I think it's a big thing that we need to address. Like church
Yeah.
happens everywhere, massive scale, local scale. And that's not to excuse it and
Totally.
does it make it okay. Like, let's talk about how it's not okay, but also let's talk about how that was people that did the hurting and not God and his word. Like, those are
Yeah.
very separate things. So, yeah, I
100%. I
speaking of,
think deconstruction is vital. Deconstruction is absolutely essential. If you don't deconstruct, you're not following Jesus.
mm,
Because, and this is, I'm gonna steal this quote from a friend of mine from Door of Hope. His name is Wesley Randolph Eder, Eader, and I say his name because everybody should look up Wesley's music. He's an incredible bluegrassy modern worship songwriter, particularly of hymns. He's just like this old soul who sounds like he's written a bluegrass gospel standard from 100 years ago, but he's a millennial in Southeast Portland, but we were at a friend's little birthday gathering in some pub somewhere, and we were talking about this, and I think it was around the time of the Mars Hill podcast, and we're talking about like friends who are deconstructing, and Wesley just said something so beautiful. He's just a simple dude, but dropped this zinger on me that I've used ever since. Where he's like, well, seems to me Jesus' whole ministry was deconstruction.
yeah,
I'm like, oh my goodness, that's exactly right. Like what Jesus came, like the Jewish understanding of Messiah and following Yahweh when Jesus shows up, like is so distorted and so messed up. And Jesus is constantly deconstructing that. It had evolved and into all these ways in which people were claiming to speak for God, but had nothing to do with God in reality. So much so that God's own son, who they were the Messiah they were longing for, shows up in the flesh. And from his first sermon, according to the Gospel of Mark, they say, let's kill him.
yeah,
Let's plot to kill him because he's such a threat to this weird stuff that we've built.
yeah,
And Jesus, his whole ministry is deconstructing the modern understanding of what it meant to be in relationship with God and putting them back to what the Old Testament scriptures really taught, and which is ultimately pointing towards him who will make the better covenant of grace over the covenant of law. And so deconstruction is vitally important. Our Savior's ministry was marked by deconstruction. The key thing about deconstruction is you must reconstruct something in its place. So deconstruction as an in itself is South Park. It's the show South Park. They're brilliant deconstructionists. They shred everyone. No one gets off the hook. Every religious group, every political persuasion, every cultural social movement, everyone gets their episode of South Park, and they just shred them, in often ways that go way over the top. The first like half of the show is usually like really insightful, and then it goes to something like over the top and just so disgusting. But like the world is really good at deconstruction. It's not really what South Park doesn't do is ever reconstruct anything positive.
yeah,
They shred bullies, but they don't show you how to love one another, and so there is a ton about the church. The Reformation deconstruction, but reconstruction in its place. So there's a lot that's worth deconstructing about the church today. I just keep reading the Gospels over and over again to remind myself of who Jesus actually is. Oftentimes over and against all the false ways that people are claiming he is, and so we have to deconstruct. And your question was, how did that lead to the ministry of Moved by Glory? For me, it was very much about deconstruction and reconstruction, just like I just talked about. It was this sense in which I had been in ministry for a long time at that point, 23-ish years when I started down this new path that led to what I'm doing now. And I'd always been involved in music. I held all these other positions as well. I started off as a worship pastor, but I was a lead pastor, did some work in church planning, was a preaching pastor, even an executive pastor at one point, of a sort. Like, they never let me handle the money. Like, I'm not that guy. But I led some other teams and the staff and some stuff like that. But when I kind of got some space, that what had been so profound for me, experiencing God through worship, through song in worship gatherings, to me, I looked around and there was I had a lot of experience over the years in a lot of different contexts, and there was a lot that was worth deconstructing about the modern context, but I wanted to build something in its place. And it clicked for me when shortly after I stepped down at Door of Hope, a friend called me out to the church that he was currently on staff at in Florida, like Southwest Florida. And I think they wanted to hire me, but like Florida is a different country, and I don't think once they got to know me, they wouldn't have liked me. And I don't think I would have liked them either. It was a good place to visit. But once I made it clear that I wasn't going to move there and join their staff, I ended up shifting kind of intuitively into this kind of consultant mode where I was like, hey, but here's the kind of leader that I think would actually be a good fit. I'm not the right fit. Like, you're in this highly educated island of wealthy, they call themselves formerly powerful people. A lot of retired CEOs and COOs companies of giant companies all across middle America that then retired to the paradise of Florida in their mind. I'm like, look, I don't have any college degrees. Like, I can't read music. Like, I'm like a kind of just everything about my music is different than what they're going to want. Like, you need somebody educated. You need somebody that comes from a culture that is either adjacent to or from the culture of Florida, like, in order to fit there. Like, it's a lot of retired Midwesterners on the southwest coast of Florida. So more than likely, you're looking for somebody from the Midwest, right? And these kind of things, and just started thinking and did some teaching on like, you need to be more clear on why you're doing what you're doing. Like, what are you doing here? And some things started to click where it's like, man, I have experience to bring to bear. I think initially I felt like I was done with ministry because so many of the things I've been a part of seemed like they failed. Like, two of the churches that I poured my life into don't exist anymore. That accounted for most of my time in ministry, Mars Hill and then Redeemer after we merged with Door of Hope. Like, they're both over. They were both buried, like I felt like I had way more L's than dubs. And I didn't know what I was going to do. But then I realized, well, actually all the weird things and unhealthy things I experienced people can learn from those things too. And so I started down this road of trying to develop kind of a profile of healthier gathered worship. And that took various forms of various kinds of consulting things that I do now. But I think central to them was this idea that that you have to have a clear purpose for what you're doing, whatever, in business, in life, in parenting, or in gathered worship. If you don't have a clear purpose, you tend to settle for pragmatism. And pragmatism is the idea that you just do what works. It's kind of like that idea I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the idea of policy versus operations theology. You can have your big ideas, but a lot of times you're just driven by practically what seems to work at your church. Well, what's the most common form of pragmatism in gathered worship these days? I would call it Christian entertainment. That is putting on a better show than the next church with better songs, performed with better musicians, with a better mix, with better production technology, thus providing better goods and services in direct competition to other churches that you're hoping to draw other customers from other churches to receive your goods and services at your church to grow attendance and giving base. And maybe you say, like, there's language that I have heard used, and at times I've even used myself, like, and there's some truth to it. There's who you reach out from and who you reach out to. And it's true, like if you don't have a stable base of Christians, even in a new church plant, no matter how evangelistic you are, it's going to be hard to build some more momentum. Who's going to be doing the evangelism? How is the church going to take on a shared life of its own if there isn't some kind of like stable, committed followers of Jesus to be that core? But even in a lot of churches who would talk a big game on reaching out to those who don't believe, a lot of what tends to really drive them is providing somewhere between content and entertainment to Christians along different kind of cultural traditions or denominational, traditional kind of traditions. And here's two very problematic assumptions that kind of takes into account is that when you fall into that pragmatism of Christian entertainment, you tend to believe that Christians need a show and we have to compete for their attention, often compete directly with other churches. And two, increasingly, and this is what I saw when I started to kind of look around and talk to other worship leader friends back in 2021, in the years since, I think this is even more the case. And that's the assumption that professionals and an ever smaller pool of quote unquote professionals have done all the work for us musically, and we just need to implement their work and give the people what they want. Yeah. And that is professionals from like the large global church movements. There was a recent article. There's a gal at Christianity Today named, I think her name is Kelsey McGinnis or Kaylee. It starts with a K and her last name is McGinnis. And she writes on Christian music for CT. And she had an article out a few weeks ago on kind of like the market share of large movements of worship. And there's really 5, but mostly 4 that account for almost all the songs that are being sung in most churches today. And there are 3 big church movements, that go back to churches, Hillsong, Bethel, and Elevation, and then Passion, which isn't as much based in one church, but is kind of a movement. And then there's a long tail after that of all kinds of other smaller churches that have somewhat of a platform, but it kind of, long tail means like if it's a graph, like the graph is like way up here for those big 4 that I mentioned, and then trails off to a tiny market share for everyone else. And I'm not preaching against Hillsong, Elevation, Bethel, or Passion. People ask all the time, like, well, what's the answer? Like to just not participate in those. And some, for a variety of reasons, feel like they shouldn't. But my encouragement is like, no, I think you can be discerning and you can apply wisdom, but don't go to just the wholesale implementation of these cultures of worship, these global cultures of worship. Because when you adopt these kind of problematic, pragmatic assumptions, Christians need a show, we have to compete for their attention, and professionals have done the work for us, and we just implement their work, and it's going to be awesome. Then we disciple our people to be fairly atheological, often unbiblical, and increasingly consumeristic. It also ignores the beauty of the local church. I talked about that a little bit earlier, but like the local church is meant to be distinct. Right now, my home church is in Vancouver, Washington. I'm currently consulting right now with a church in McMinnville. Those should look different.
Mm-hmm.
Although the church I'm at in Vancouver is a little bit on the kind of outer edge, bleeding into the rural in the same way as like McMinnville's in that weird, like everyone out in the Willamette Valley is in this weird thing where they used to be rural, but now they're in this like wine suburb kind of existence. I don't know what you call it, like a wine burb. Like the wine industry in the Willamette Valley has radically changed in places like McMinnville and Forest Grove and tiny towns that used to be blink and you miss it, like Carlton now has like hipsters and restaurants and wineries and tasting rooms. Like it's really interesting. But my point is, like, local churches should reflect that local reality. And I'm not arguing for like the early days of Mars Hill, where somebody walks in and they have no idea what's going on because you're so contextualized that you don't do anything that other Christians do. I think that's over contextualization. But I think a lot of churches are under contextualized to their local context because they're increasingly pressured to adopt global cultures of worship. And what we do when we do that is we tend to treat everyone, and here's what gets really messy and gross, believer and unbeliever alike, you start to treat them both as if they're a consumer Christian. Who should inherently care about these big global cultural movements. These global cultural movements, my big criticism with them, my chief criticism of them is that they are made for the broadest audience possible. A local church should not be in that business. Local church is in the business of a specific group of people gathered in a specific time, in a specific place. This missiologist author, named Leslie Newbigin, he has this phrase that the gospel is, the local church is the hermeneutic of the gospel. So it's like how you work the gospel out amongst a particular people in a particular place. And there should be glorious diversity and uniqueness from local church to local church. And so what I challenge people to do in my ministry is to think about why they do what they do in worship. Instead of just passively importing a foreign culture of gathered worship, consider what it means to be worshipers for this particular people in this particular place in this particular time. And there's kind of three phases to that. First, it's going back to the scripture and let the scripture define what worship is and what worship isn't. If you actually read in the scripture, worship is mentioned a lot and very rarely in conjunction with singing. Singing is an outworking of worship in the scripture, but worship has a lot more to do with how you live your life, what you're going to do with your money, what you're going to do parenting, what you're going to do with your sexuality. It says things like whatever, or Romans 12, like it talks about worshiping God being a living sacrifice of worship, as opposed to a dead sacrifice in Old Testament context where you kill an animal as a specific offering for some kind of sin. Now you are a living sacrifice. Someone that has given over to you, who dies to yourself and lives all of life to a new life, seeking God's glory in everything that you do. That's the kind of way that the Bible talks about worship. So first of all, we got to deconstruct the idea that worship is a genre of music. Because when most people talk about worship, they're like, they come to you, folks like you and me, and say the worship was great today. What do they mean? They mean the music was great. So we got to disciple our people that it's unbiblical to say the worship is great. Now, I don't want to be an annoying theological nerd who's like, wait there, and correct correct everybody every time they say it. I'm not that guy. But still, like, if we don't disciple our people in what the Bible says, just because it's popular, we're forming unbiblical disciples of Jesus. Like worship is a big overarching category. I believe it's the continuous outpouring of all humanity, for better or for worse. One of the biggest things you'll see about worship is that it's often talked about idolatry, maybe even more than God glorifying worship. So it's not inherently God glorifying. It's not just musical. So you got to get a biblical sense of what worship is and what it isn't. And then based on that, Secondly, you got to move to defining a clear purpose statement for why you do what you do in gathered worship. Gathered worship is a subset of worship overall. I use the terms gathered and scattered. We gather for worship gatherings, but then we're scattered as worshipers in all of life. Worship doesn't start when we enter a seemingly sacred space. It continues. We come worshiping. We continue our worship together in word and sacrament and song, and then we leave taking that same heart of worship into all the stuff of life, in whatever we do to make a living, in whatever we do in the rest of life, all of life to the glory of God. So what do we do in gathered worship that should be done in light of that bigger biblical definition of worship? What is the purpose for gathered worship? And it's not just putting on a better show, right? My purpose statement is where I get the name of the ministry is hearts moved by the glory of God in gathered worship. Heart, biblically, the deepest part of who we are, what makes me, is moved. We're not just saying true things about God, because James tells us demons can do that, and I don't think God's glorified by that. So it's not just theological recitation, reciting true things about God. It's actually being moved by them. It's being overwhelmed by God's forgiveness in a way that moves you in the deepest part of who you are and changes you to be more like Jesus, and be passionate to share that with others, other Christians and other non-Christians. So hearts moved by what? By the glory of God, all that makes God glorious, which is what we see in the scripture. So you start with what is worship biblically and what is it not. Then as a subset of that, you got to get clear on what are we doing in gathered worship. What is the purpose that we're actually working for? And then with all that in mind, I think you can start to build a local culture of worship in light of God's mission, that we're God's people sent on a mission, his culture-making, image-bearing people set to represent him wherever we are, in the stuff that we do, in the stuff that we make, in the way that we live. And that takes place in a particular time, in a particular place. And there's such an increasing pressure for churches and churchgoers to have a global identity, often at the expense of a local identity. It's the kind of almost like the metaphor we've all seen this. It's like somebody's walking in a beautiful place, looking at their phone the whole time because they're more obsessed with whatever's going on in the rest of the world through social media than the beauty they can take in there. It's being at an incredible show. And, I take pictures at a concert. I'll even take a video occasionally at a concert. But what's super annoying is that guy that's standing in front of you and he's got his phone up here. I'm a little taller, so like I can still usually see, but have mercy on the shorter folks who that guy's freaking phone is like blocking their view the whole time because even then he's like trying to experience the show through his phone as a globe or be streaming it on his live stream.
Yeah.
That's why increasingly you're seeing artists like Jack White and all kinds of others, like they require you to put your phone in a sealed, they have phone isolation services that are required to enter and be a part of their show, because to be a part of their show is to actually be in the moment, So we're not global Christians. We're not a global church. We're a local church. And increasingly, worship leaders are being discipled to want to grow out of the local church. The aspiration of a lot of church musicians right now is to build a platform where they can break up with the church and be an independent artist, that's not linked to a specific church. And so we've got striving, ambitious musicians using small churches as a stepping stone to a medium-sized church to hopefully get the platform and take their gifts as far as they can go to build the biggest platform possible so that they can ultimately kind of like break up with the church and just be an independent musician. It's brutal. That's not the heart of everybody. I'm not trying to throw everybody under the bus in that way or whatever, but these are, everybody that's around modern worship culture knows what I'm talking about is the unfortunate reality too much. So my ministry is just trying to challenge churches to think through these things. What does the Bible say about worship? What is going to be our purpose? You don't have to adopt my statement, but the purpose for your worship gatherings, and then what does it look like to be a local church? I don't have a program to implement with people. I'm definitely not trying to reproduce Mars Hill, in Vancouver or McMinnville or in any, when I consulted with the church my wife grew up at in Estacada. That's not the goal. It's to help local churches think through how to be more biblically faithful and more contextualized to their local context. And too much of the modern worship music draws you away from biblical fidelity and specificity, and away from that local identity into this like much lower biblical and cultural common denominator. That's what I think the problem is. So I think we can pick and choose which Bethel, Hillsong, and Elevation songs to use. I use songs from all of those movements. I don't use all of them. I don't use them just because they're the most popular ones. And here's where the rubber really meets the road. I do not play them with tracks. I do not play them to song select charts. And I do not play them always with the cues. I arrange them. Not everybody is well suited to write a bunch of original music for your songs. But when I'm talking about contextualization, everyone can arrange. Yeah. Even if you can't write, everyone can arrange. And when you play off a song select chart and play to a cue track, and I'm not saying these things are evil or sinful. I'm not trying to condemn everybody who does it. And there's fruitful and helpful uses of these things. But when you do these, unfortunately, like these things tie you. Your song select charts, they can't be edited. Mm-hmm. And they tie you to the radio version of the song. Yeah. The radio version of the song is not, in most cases, is not the appropriate arrangement for congregational participation. Yeah. And anybody who has been involved in recording music knows that how you record a song that sounds good on a recording is often a different set of considerations than how you would play it live. Mm-hmm. They're two different things. They overlap. They relate to one another, but they're not the same thing. And even more so when the goal is congregational participation and engagement. So increasingly, unfortunately, what I see around the church is like increasingly Sunday worship is becoming a show for popular music where church consumers gather to see a local karaoke performance of the worship hits from the radio. And that's done for very specific financial and monetary reasons by the artists and especially the labels. I'm not condemning all that. I think artists should get paid. But I'm saying whenever there's this very specific financial incentive, it's at least cause for wisdom and discernment. And so my encouragement is to think through these things as a local church, and create music for your local church. One of my other little soapboxes is I don't believe there's any such thing as Christian music. There's no style of music advocated in the scriptures. And if we were going to really do music that sounded like the music of the early church, it would sound more like a Muslim call to prayer than Coldplay for Jesus, like our modern music. It was before the 12-tone scale was invented, many, many centuries before that. Like we have a very specific culture of music in our modern times, and that is not in itself holy. Mm-hmm. We tend to want to baptize preference with like spiritual importance, when really let's just call a spade. Like a certain generation wants piano-led hymns. That's just because they want it. Back in my day, like when I was coming up, there was like serious culture wars over drums and lots of preachers saying drums were demonic. And honestly, like, I don't want to step on too many toes here, but like, I think in a pretty racist way, because the argument was like, well, literally, this is what was said and what was written in Bible commentaries. I won't name the names of the people who wrote this, but this is like literally what they said is drums are adopted from African demonic cultures, and so we don't use drums because we're not a slave to demonic, spiritual, mindless rhythms and dancing. That's what it was said growing up. Like drums are our gateway to Satanism and the demonic. Like that was literally what it was said in the late 80s, early 90s. Now the ship has sailed, but there's still folk who, kind of at least low key believe it, or maybe full key believe it. I'm not sure, but let's just call a spade a spade. Like they're just contextualizing. Folks that prefer piano-led hymns, they're contextualizing. Everybody contextualizes. They're just contextualizing to a different time. Maybe there's a place for that. But my point is if there's no such thing as a Christian music style, and it certainly isn't pop worship, that's manufactured in these local church cultures and increasingly with the influence of Nashville. There's a reason why the lines between modern worship music and modern country music sound very similar, because it's the same producers, it's the same studio musicians recorded in the same studios. That's why you're seeing more and more collaboration between country artists and worship and quote unquote modern worship artists. They were in the same studio at the same time. Might as well do a jam together, right? So my point in the middle of all that is apply discernment and have that heart of like a local musician who you don't have to reject everything from those big cultures, but who are your people? And if the purpose of gather worship is hearts moved by the glory of God, what kind of music moves the hearts of your specific local church?
Yeah.
And that's going to take experimentation. So song like Goodness of God, the first time I heard it, I'm like, hey, that's a fine song, but it's kind of a country song. Mm-hmm. Well, you can definitely twang that up a good bit and swing it. And it's a really cool, like country slow jam, and country is growing a lot more popular and a lot more mainstream. And, what if you started to experiment rather than considering the lowest common denominator of music that rounds off all, when I come and I lead music at a church, a comment that I'll get over and over again lately is like, man, your music was like way more like a specific genre. And to which I say, like, thank you. That was the point. They're like, your music's so different. It sounds so different. Like, well, it's because I don't listen to Christian music very much, and that's my encouragement to worship leaders. If you're going to love music, be lovers of music. Don't just be lovers of Christian music.
Yeah.
If you become a lover of music, then you'll know what's good Christian music and what isn't. And I'm not talking lyrically. That's a separate thing. I think you judge the lyrical content according to the scripture. I think we should be very careful with that.
Yeah.
That's not to say every song has to be a self-contained systematic theology like in Christ alone. You can have a vague song, and a vague song is filled with meaning by a specific song, or if it follows a very specific sermon. There's a place for like vague repetitive songs, but there shouldn't be a place for an unbiblical lyric, like something that directly contradicts scripture. And you got to sort that out in your context with your leaders. But so that's a biblical criteria for lyrics. We just don't have a biblical criteria for music. I think we have a biblical criteria that it's supposed to be congregational. Yeah. People are supposed to participate. It's not supposed to be just a concert where you show your giftedness and everybody observes. Right. That's not biblical gathered worship. So it's got to be able to be singable, and that does constrain things. Like hip hop is a very valid personal expression of worship, but it's not usually the most helpful corporate expression of worship because there's a lot of words. And most white people, particularly in places white as we live, they can't get those words out fast enough and together. It's just not going to be conducive to people participating. So there's a difference between a personal expression of worship, like heavy music, like various forms of like metal and such, like very valid personal expression of worship, not the most appropriate form for corporate worship and singing. So that does constrain. It's like, how far can we be creative and genre specific while it's still singable? I think that's what we got to work out at our local church. What can you experiment with? How can you change things up? How can you train your musicians? What's really sad to me is when I go with musicians, and if I turn the cue track off, they kind of freak out because these musicians have been trained to only listen to the cue track, rather than even listen to each other. And man, that's sad. Like from a musical perspective, from a local church leadership perspective, like it's almost as if like it kind of is in the same way as like these producers are leading our songs for us. Right. And we're playing along with them. Like, man, it's totally fine to use their song, but make it your own in some way, and make it your own in a way that like fits your people. We all set aside some of our creativity to serve the local church. So that'd be one of my encouragements to folks. That this a lot of what I help churches think through in various ways. I have this evaluation process where I come in and give a church kind of like 360 feedback on their worship gathering. That's what I'm doing with that church in McMinnville this week. I'll do coaching, I'll do teaching, I'll do workshops, I'll do little conferences, all kinds of different ways. But that's the goal. It's to help folks think through what is worship biblically, what should be a biblical purpose to drive our worship gatherings, how to build a local, more local church contextualization, and then link all of the things we actually do, the songs we sing, the way our liturgy works, how our production technology works. Make sure that they're all brought into line with those ideals, so that our policy theology is as unified as it can possibly be with our operations theology, what actually drives our practice. So that has, for me personally, it's been a great opportunity, as God has blessed that in different ways, to be able to stay in the midst of the church and to continue to serve the church without some of the pressure that a lot of my previous time in church leadership had. I'm really grateful for that. But two things are driving me to another transition. One, I'm getting increasingly a little antsy because I'm not as involved. I live in the middle of Southeast Portland. I have a heart for Portland. I love Portland. It's getting less popular to love Portland, but I really do. And I want to, what started off as feeling like it was a good break now feels like I want to be more involved again in local church leadership. And so I'm looking for that, a bit more locally. And secondly, man, I love what I've gotten to do, but it hasn't really worked consistently financially for me. At times it has, but it's only really worked financially for me when I've had other interim type roles that were steady alongside it. And so I'm looking for other work at the same time too. I want to be, like I was critical earlier of saying a lot of folk just share this heroic journey of man, it was tough and then I figured it out and now it's just awesome. It's just been great ever since. And maybe that is somebody's story, but it's not mine. It's been tough. And I'm at a crossroads again of all the advice I was giving to young people to consider and find other ways. I don't know where God's leading me. I got to provide for my family, and it's not working just doing this freelance thing. A lot of folk have dabbled in freelance from COVID to the present, and some have found a way to make it work, that side hustle dream, and some haven't, and it's not working for me completely right now. And so I'm looking for other work, whether that's ministry or ministry adjacent. I'm still going to be involved in ministry. I still want to do the work that I've been doing with Moved by Glory. But I need to find some other sources of income to stabilize that and prop it up. So the advice I'm giving to everybody else is very much when I'm talking about the issues of calling and your identity being rattled a bit and stuff, man, I'm in it right in the same time trying to work out what that means for me after almost, let's see, this is my 28th year in vocational ministry. I'm 50 years old. And, I've had what some people would consider some spectacular success and some pretty spectacular failure as well. I'm very much in it trying to figure it out. I think not every life is as weird and bumpy as mine has been, but I think there's a lot of weird bumpiness in life. And I would encourage the younger folks who hear this, man, walk closely with Jesus and try to find as diverse a way as you can to, support yourself financially, which can free you up towards the ministry that you really love and feel like God is leading you to. And that's what I'm trying to do. And above all else, man, grow as a worshiper. If your heart is not deeply moved by the glory of God in general, and specifically through song, why would you expect anybody else's to? Why you shouldn't, right? And if they are, you're going to feel this growing imposter syndrome some imposter syndrome is spiritual attack that should be rebuked and corrected, and some imposter syndrome is real. And if you don't believe what you're preaching and singing, you're going to feel an increasing imposter syndrome, and you should. You might need to take a break. You may need to rediscover that first love. Like, when was the last time you teared up at the profound grace of God? That God, it doesn't happen every time, but like, there's oftentimes when I'm in this room, this is my office, when I'm preparing music or something, and the songs just hit me, and I'm hearing just like in tears singing that song, and sometimes that translates, to a similar emotional experience when I lead it in a worship gathering, and sometimes it doesn't. But man, I think more than ever, my heart is still more deeply moved than ever by the glory of God, by what Jesus has done for me. And as crazy and as jacked up as the church is, the Bible is like super clear that if you're going to belong to Jesus, nobody, when I grew up, and my parents even more so, like, they grew up with this language of inviting Jesus into your heart as your personal savior. It's just not biblical. There is a sense in which we do have to make a personal decision, but when we come to be a follower of Jesus, we come to follow him personally, but we also are baptized not just into relationship with him, but with his people. Mm. The body of Christ is called the body of Christ because it's the physical presence of Jesus in the world. Now, we do a pretty crappy job, more times than not, of representing Jesus. And yet the church is still his plan. So you can't, like, there's no biblical context. I'm not just trying to, like, say, you're wrong, do better. But biblically speaking, I'm just saying, like, there's no context for saying I love Jesus, but not the church. Like, you could say I love Jesus and I've been so hurt by the church, I don't know how to belong to one anymore. And man, I get that. And I have felt that. I feel that some Sundays, especially when I start to feel kind of like a hired gun at some other church, and yet, like, man, walking with Jesus is meant to be walking with his people and serving his people. And if you don't feel like you can do that, if you're involved in church leadership and you don't feel like you can do that at the church that you're at, like, that certainly calls for discernment. And I'm not saying, like, split second be out. Man, find a church that you can belong to. Yeah. Where you love others and feel loved by them, where they know you for something more than just your gifts. Mm. Increasingly, folk like us, are artistic folks of one sort or another, like, the church is dying for artists, and they don't really care that much about your life sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. And even if they mean well, they're just so desperate that they'll bring us in to do stuff, and they want to care for us, but we don't belong to their church, And it can become this vicious cycle where it's like, I'm scared to belong to a church, but I'll still use my gifts. But then I'm upset that I don't feel like I belong to a church. It's like, man, at some point, you need to belong to a church. You need to belong to a people. That would just be my encouragement, is for local churches to be local churches that live out life together with God. That we would serve those local churches, and that if we're going to be involved in leading worship through song, that we would grow to really believe what we're saying, that we'd be deeply moved and not just going through the motions. Yeah. And for me, and it's really hard. Like, I was at a church last week, and the musicians were really uncomfortable not using the cue track. And it was hard for me to have that sense of connectedness while using the cue track. Maybe for some others it's become totally natural, and maybe that's okay, But just like, man, sometimes our gatherings can become so rushed, and just like playing the songs, everyone learning the parts exactly as the recordings were, and getting people in and out so that the parking lot doesn't get jammed, and the children's ministry people don't freak out. And all those are real things. Parking is an issue. Children's ministry workers can be really bummed out. I get it. But maybe then we need to allow more time between our gatherings, even if that cuts into our growth. I don't know. There isn't a silver bullet, but like, man, are we forming people that are deeply moved by God's glory? Um, or are we getting people through our doors as quickly as possible to just as if we invited Descartes into our hearts as our personal savior? Descartes, the famous French Enlightenment philosopher who says, "I think, therefore I am." In so many churches, their highest expectation of what God would do in a worship gathering is give us new ideas to correct our thinking. And that's really important. I'm not trying to deconstruct preaching. It's vital. I'm a theological person. I hope that comes through in what I've said. But it's not the only thing. It's word and experience.
Yeah.
It's word and spirit. And too many of our churches decide that they're going to be one or the other. It's either an experience, oftentimes untethered from the truth of Scripture, or a deep reverence for the Scripture that's super skeptical of anyone having any experience. It's both.
Yeah.
The same Paul that wrote all the potent theology of the epistle says, "I wish all of you spoke in tongues and did it more than I do." Those aren't two different kinds of churches in Paul's mind, like for Paul, that wasn't a conflict like between a Reformed theology church and a charismatic church. Those terms didn't exist. They shouldn't be as stark distinctions as they are between us. So yeah, just all that to say, man, I just didn't challenge you. It starts with us as leaders, that our hearts would be more deeply moved by Jesus. And it will always be a conflict with the nuts and bolts. Sunday's always coming. But don't let yourself fall into pragmatism, and don't let your heart get hard and just become a hired gun that gets used,
Yeah.
Be a worshiper, be a follower of Jesus.
It's so good. And I love hearing you talk about this, because the heart of Creative Tides is to resource and equip creatives, those who are in the church, but also just creatives in their local community, that we would be able to empower and train and resource them in their innate giftings, and like maximize those skills so they can then go out and serve. It's not trying to make any church look a certain way, but it's leaning into the strengths that are there, the stylistically, the skill that is already there, and how can we come alongside and maximize that so that you can better serve. And whether that's in a church, or if you're in the local community, maybe you're a sound tech and you're doing gigs on Saturday nights in a venue downtown Portland, and then you're at a church on Sunday morning, but you just love running sound. Like, how can we come alongside and equip that? And so I think for those who are in leadership in a church, that where so much of this pressure and isolation comes, is trying to make it like, one of the big four, like trying to be exactly like Elevation. And for us, like, we're in Newburgh, we're in a 25,000 person town. Our building comfortably seats 240. It's a 100-year-old building. Like, it would be silly for me to try to be Elevation. And the other thing you got to consider is, Elevation, those are all hired musicians, and they're playing together all the time. And like you tapped into, a lot of the studio musicians are different from the live musicians, and those studio musicians are just doing the circuit, playing with country artists and pop artists, all the secular artists, and then swinging around to the Christian artists. And that's not the case in the church. In the church, you rarely have hired musicians. And usually you're working with people who are volunteers that have families and day jobs, and it is a sacrifice of their time to do this. And so what are the skills that they're bringing in? How can you craft it to be your own thing? Where are your people in your congregation? Where are they at? What sermon series are you in? What scriptures are you studying? Like, how can you incorporate all of that so that, yes, you can still use resources and tools, but don't become dependent on those things, because the goal is not becoming like so-and-so. The goal is using your talents and your giftings together as the church, as the body. And so, I just so appreciate your perspective. And obviously you have a lot of experience, and your personal history of Mars Hill growing to be this massive thing, and then also walking through the downfall of that, like you've seen both sides, and you really can speak into like you have to make it your own thing, and
Mm,
it has to come from a place of deep conviction and love for the Lord. And
mm.
then the form that it takes, the genre, whatever, like the form it takes, that part can just be fun and you can experiment, but that part doesn't matter as much as the place that
Yeah,
it's from. So I
totally.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, so appreciate
I,
that, and I know it will be encouraging to a lot of people in their local church context. So
that's great. Yeah, I love the work that you guys do with Creative Ties. Definitely a very kindred spirit. And yeah, thanks so much for having me.
yeah, if people want to learn more about you and Moved by Glory, where are some places that they can go, websites, podcasts, that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I just have a simple little website at movedbyglory.com. So, no Greek words. You can spell it. And I'll be honest, like post Mars Hill, since it was such a social media kind of mediated church, um, I don't have a super high view of social media in response to that, and I don't do a ton with it. I do a little bit, but I think anybody that would like to learn more about the ministry can check out my website. There's a little easy contact form. You can email me at tim@movedbyglory.com. And if you want to connect, or if there's any way that I could help or encourage you as a leader or your church, like I would be happy to have any of those conversations and explore what that might look like. There's some little examples on my website of some of the things that I do, so you can find out a little bit more about that. But then we could definitely, have a meal or a beverage and talk more.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much for sharing and taking so much time with us. I'm really encouraged and inspired from our conversation, and just appreciate you and your heart, and just genuinely your love for the Lord and wanting to authentically reflect him and move others towards him. I
Mm,
can
yeah,
tell that
thank you.
that is your goal, and how you live your life, ministry or not, that it's to be a reflection of him, and to draw people towards him. So just appreciate that about you. And yeah, thank you for
Thank
taking.
you. I appreciate that, Ashley. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Creative Tides podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow us on social media so you don't miss any upcoming resources. If you'd like to support Creative Tides, including events, workshops, and tools like this podcast, head to www.creative-tides.com to make a donation. Thanks so much for being a part.